Chapter 37. The two gentlemen left Rosings the next morning, and Mr. Collins, having been
Sonnet
waiting
94
to make them his departing obeisance,
they
was able
that
to
have
bring
power
home
to
the pleasing
hurt
intelligence
and will do
of their
none,
appearing in very good health,
that do not
and
do
as
the
full of
things
spirits as could
they
be
most
expected
do show,
after the melancholy
who,
scene so lately gone
moving
through.
others, are themselves
To Rosings,
as stone,
he then hastened,
unmoved, cold,
consoled
and
Lady
to
Catherine and
temptation
daughter,
slow.
and on his return
They
brought back
rightly
with
do
great
inherit
satisfaction a message
heaven's
from the lady,
graces, and husband
that she
nature's
felt herself
riches
so
from
dull
expense.
as to make her very
They
desirous of
are
having
the
more to dine with
lords
her.
and owners of their faces.
Hello there.
Could not see Lady
If this works, it's a
Book
miracle.
first,
Chapter 1
Because I've been
of
racing
The Hunchback of
to
Notre
try to
Dame
set
by
up
Victor
the
Hugo.
is to
Translated
us
by Isabel F. Hapgood.
though to
Read
itself
by Mark Douglas Nelson.
it only lives.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Preface. A few years ago, while visiting, or rather rummaging about Notre Dame, the author of this book found, in an obscure nook of one of the towers, the following word, engraved by hand upon the wall: Anarch. These Greek capitals, black with age, and quite deeply graven in the stone, with I know not what signs peculiar to Gothic calligraphy, imprinted upon their forms and upon their attitudes, as though with the purpose of revealing that it had been a hand of the Middle Ages which had inscribed them there, and especially the fatal and melancholy meaning contained in them, struck the author deeply. He questioned himself. He sought to divine who could have been that soul in torment which had not been willing to quit this world without leaving this stigma of crime or unhappiness upon the brow of the ancient church. Afterwards, the wall was whitewashed or scraped down, I know not which, and the inscription disappeared. For it is thus that people have been in the habit of proceeding with the marvelous churches of the Middle Ages for the last 200 years. Mutilations come to them from every quarter, from within as well as from without. The priest whitewashes them, the archdeacon scrapes them down, then the populace arrives and demolishes them. Thus, with the exception of the fragile memory which the author of this book here consecrates to it, there remains today nothing whatever of the mysterious word engraved within the gloomy tower of Notre Dame, nothing of the destiny which it so sadly summed up. The man who wrote that word upon the wall disappeared from the midst of the generations of man many centuries ago. The word, in its turn, has been effaced from the wall of the church. The church will, perhaps, itself soon disappear from the face of the earth. It is upon this word that this book is founded. March 1831. Book First, Chapter 1. The Grand Hall. 348 years, 6 months, and 19 days ago today, the Parisians awoke to the sound of all the bells in the triple circuit of the city, the university, and the town ringing a full peal. The 6th of January, 1482, is not, however, a day of which history has preserved the memory. There was nothing notable in the event which thus set the belles and the bourgeois of Paris in a ferment from early morning. It was neither an assault by the Picards nor the Burgundians, nor a hunt led along in procession, nor a revolt of scholars in the town of Laz, nor an entry of our much-dread lord Monsieur the King, nor even a pretty hanging of male and female thieves in the courts of Paris. Neither was it the arrival, so frequent in the 15th century, of some plumed and bedizened embassy. It was barely 2 days since the last cavalcade of that nature, that of the Flemish ambassadors charged with concluding the marriage between the Dauphin and Marguerite of Flanders, had made its entry into Paris, to the great annoyance of Monsieur le Cardinal le Bourbon, who, for the sake of pleasing the king, had been obliged to assume an amiable mien towards this whole rustic rabble of Flemish burgomasters, and to regale them at his Hôtel de Bourbon with a very pretty morality, allegorical satire, and farce, while a driving rain drenched the magnificent tapestries at his door. What put the whole population of Paris in commotion, as Jehan de Troyes expresses it, on the 6th of January was the double solemnity, united from time immemorial, of the Epiphany and the Feast of Fools. On that day, there was to be a bonfire at the Place de Grève, a maypole at the Chapelle de Brac, and a mystery at the Palais de Justice. It had been cried, to the sound of the trumpet, the preceding evening at all the crossroads by the provost's men, clad in handsome, short, sleeveless coats of violet camelet, with large white crosses upon their breasts. So the crowd of citizens, male and female, having closed their houses and shops, thronged from every direction at early morn towards some one of the 3 spots designated. Each had made his choice. One the bonfire, another the maypole, another the mystery play. It must be stated, in honor of the good sense of the loungers of Paris, that the greater part of this crowd directed their steps towards the bonfire, which was quite in season, or towards the mystery play, which was to be presented in the grand hall of the Palais de Justice, the courts of law, which was well roofed and walled, and that the curious left the poor, scantily flowered maypole to shiver all alone beneath the sky of January in the cemetery of the Chapel of Brac. The populace thronged the avenues of the law courts in particular, because they knew that the Flemish ambassadors, who had arrived 2 days previously, intended to be present at the representation of the mystery, and at the election of the Pope of Fools, which was also to take place in the Grand Hall. It was no easy matter on that day to force one's way into that Grand Hall, although it was then reputed to be the largest covered enclosure in the world. It is true that Sauval had not yet measured the Grand Hall of the Château of Montargis. The Palace Place, encumbered with people, offered to the curious gazers at the windows the aspect of a sea, into which 5 or 6 streets, like so many mouths of rivers, discharged every moment fresh floods of heads. The waves of this crowd, augmented incessantly, dashed against the angles of the houses which projected here and there, like so many promontories, into the irregular basin of the Place. In the center of the lofty Gothic facade of the palace, the grand staircase, incessantly ascended and descended by a double current, which, after parting on the intermediate landing place, flowed in broad waves along its lateral slopes. The grand staircase, I say, trickled incessantly into the Place, like a cascade into a lake. The cries, the laughter, the trampling of those thousands of feet produced a great noise and a great clamor. From time to time, this noise and clamor redoubled. The current, which drove the crowd towards the grand staircase, flowed backwards, became troubled, formed whirlpools. This was produced by the buffet of an archer, or the horse of one of the provost's sergeants, which kicked to restore order. An admirable tradition which the provostship has bequeathed to the constabulary to the maréchaussée, the maréchaussée to our gendarmerie of Paris. Thousands of good, calm bourgeois faces thronged the windows, the doors, the dormer windows, the roofs, gazing at the palace, gazing at the populace, and asking nothing more. For many Parisians content themselves with the spectacle of the spectators, and a wall behind which something is going on becomes at once, for us, a very curious thing indeed. If it could be granted to us, the men of 1830, to mingle in thought with those Parisians of the 15th century, and to enter with them, jostled, elbowed, pulled about, into that immense hall of the palace, which was so cramped on that 6th of January 1482, the spectacle would not be devoid of either interest or charm, and we should have about us only things that were so old that they would seem new. With the reader's consent, we will endeavor to retrace in thought the impression which he would have experienced in company with us on crossing the threshold of that grand hall, in the midst of that tumultuous crowd in surcoats, short sleeveless jackets, and doublets. And first of all, there is a buzzing in the ears, a dazzlement in the eyes. Above our heads is a double ogive vault, paneled with wood carving, painted azure, and sewn with golden fleur-de-lis. Beneath our feet, a pavement of black and white marble, alternating. A few paces distant, an enormous pillar, then another, 7 pillars in all, down the length of the hall, sustaining the spring of the arches of the double vault in the center of its width. Around 4 of the pillars, stalls of merchants, all sparkling with glass and tinsel. Around the last 3, benches of oak, worn and polished by the trunk hose of the litigants and the robes of the attorneys. Around the hall, along the lofty wall, between the doors, between the windows, between the pillars, the interminable row of all the kings of France, from Pharamond down, the lazy kings with pedant arms and downcast eyes, the valiant and combative kings with heads and arms raised boldly heavenward. Then, in the long pointed windows, glass of 1,000 hues. At the wide entrances to the hall, rich doors, finely sculptured. And all, the vaults, pillars, walls, jambs, paneling, doors, statues, covered from top to bottom with a splendid blue and gold illumination, which, a trifle tarnished at the epoch when we behold it, had almost entirely disappeared beneath dust and spiders in the year of grace 1549, when de Breuil still admired it from tradition. Let the reader picture to himself now this immense oblong hall, illuminated by the pallid light of a January day, invaded by a motley and noisy throng which drifts along the walls and eddies round the 7 pillars, and he'll have a confused idea of the whole effect of the picture, whose curious details we shall make an effort to indicate with more precision. It is certain that if Ravaillac had not assassinated Henri IV, there would have been no documents in the trial of Ravaillac deposited in the clerk's office of the Palais de Justice, no accomplices interested in causing the said documents to disappear, hence no incendiaries obliged, for the lack of better means, to burn the clerk's office in order to burn the documents, and to burn the Palais de Justice in order to burn the clerk's office. Consequently, in short, no conflagration in 1618. The old Palais would be standing still, with its ancient grand hall. I should be able to say to the reader, "Go and look at it," and we should thus both escape the necessity, I of making and he of reading a description of it, such as it is, which demonstrates a new truth, that great events have incalculable results. It is true that it may be quite possible in the first place that Ravaillac had no accomplices, and in the second that if he had any, they were in no way connected with the fire of 1618. 2 other very plausible explanations exist. First, the great flaming star, a foot broad and a cubit high, which fell from heaven, as everyone knows, upon the law courts after midnight on the 7th of March. Second, Théophile's quatrain. Sure 'twas but a sorry game, when at Paris Dame Justice, through having eaten too much spice, set the palace all aflame. Whatever may be thought of this triple explanation, political, physical, and poetical, of the burning of the law courts in 1618, the unfortunate fact of the fire is certain. Very little today remains, thanks to this catastrophe, thanks above all to the successive restorations which have completed what it spared. Very little remains of that first dwelling of the kings of France, of that elder palace of the Louvre, already so old in the time of Philip the Handsome, that they sought there for the traces of the magnificent buildings erected by King Robert and described by Helgaldus. Nearly everything has disappeared. What has become of the chamber of the Chancellery, where Saint Louis consummated his marriage? The garden where he administered justice, clad in a coat of camelot, a surcoat of linsey-woolsey without sleeves, and a surmantle of black sandal, as he lay upon the carpet with Jean V. Where is the chamber of the Emperor Sigismund, and that of Charles IV, that of Jean the Landless? Where is the staircase from which Charles VI promulgated his edict of pardon? The slab where Marcel cut the throats of Robert de Clermont and the Marshal of Champagne in the presence of the Dauphin? The wicket where the bulls of Pope Benedict were torn, and whence those who had brought them departed decked out in derision in copes and mitres, and making an apology through all Paris? And the grand hall, with its gilding, its azure, its statues, its pointed arches, its pillars, its immense vaults, all fretted with carvings? And the gilded chamber, and the stone lion which stood at the door, with lowered head and tail between his legs, like the lions on the throne of Solomon, in the humiliated attitude which befits force in the presence of justice? And the beautiful doors, and the stained glass, and the chaste ironwork which drove Biscornet to despair, and the delicate woodwork of Annecy? What has time, what have men done with these marvels? What have they given us in return for all this Gallic history, for all this Gothic art? The heavy, flattened arches of Monsieur de Brosset, that awkward architect of the Saint-Gervais portal. So much for art. And, as for history, we have the gossiping reminiscences of the Great Pillar, still ringing with the tattle of the patrouille. It is not much. Let us return to the veritable grand hall of the veritable old palace. The two extremities of this gigantic parallelogram were occupied, the one by the famous marble table, so long, so broad, and so thick that, as the ancient land rolls, in a style that would have given Gargantua an appetite, say, "Such a slice of marble as was never beheld in the world." The other by the chapel where Louis XI had himself sculptured on his knees before the Virgin, and whither he caused to be brought, without heeding the two gaps thus made in the row of royal statues, the statues of Charlemagne and of Saint Louis, two saints whom he supposed to be great in favor in heaven, as kings of France. This chapel, quite new, having been built only 6 years, was entirely in that charming taste of delicate architecture, of marvelous sculpture, of fine and deep chasing, which marks with us the end of the Gothic era, and which is perpetuated to about the middle of the 16th century in the fairy-like fancies of the Renaissance. The little open-work rose window, pierced above the portal, was, in particular, a masterpiece of lightness and grace. One would have pronounced it a star of lace. In the middle of the hall, opposite the great door, a platform of gold brocade placed against the wall, a special entrance to which had been effected through a window in the corridor of the gold chamber, had been erected for the Flemish emissaries and the other great personages invited to the presentation of the mystery play. It was upon the marble table that the mystery was to be enacted as usual. It had been arranged for the purpose early in the morning. Its rich slabs of marble, all scratched by the heels of law clerks, supported a cage of carpenter's work of considerable height, the upper surface of which, within view of the whole hall, was to serve as the theatre, and whose interior, masked by tapestries, was to take the place of dressing rooms for the personages of the piece. A ladder, naively placed on the outside, was to serve as means of communication between the dressing room and the stage, and lend its rude rungs to entrances as well as to exits. There was no personage, however unexpected, no sudden change, no theatrical effect, which was not obliged to mount that ladder. Innocent and venerable infancy of art and contrivances. 4 of the bailiff of the palace's sergeants, perfunctory guardians of all the pleasures of the people on days of festival as well as on days of execution, stood at the 4 corners of the marble table. The piece was only to begin with the 12th stroke of the great palace clock sounding midday. It was very late, no doubt, for a theatrical representation, but they had been obliged to fix the hour to suit the convenience of the ambassadors. Now, this whole multitude had been waiting since morning. A goodly number of curious, good people had been shivering since daybreak before the grand staircase of the palace. Some even affirmed that they had passed the night across the threshold of the great door, in order to make sure that they should be the first to pass in. The crowd grew more dense every moment, and, like water, which rises above its normal level, began to mount along the walls, to swell around the pillars, to spread out on the entablatures, on the cornices, on the window-sills, on all the salient points of the architecture, on all the reliefs of the sculpture. Hence, discomfort, impatience, weariness, the liberty of a day of cynicism and folly, the quarrels which break forth for all sorts of causes, a pointed elbow, an iron-shod shoe, the fatigue of long waiting, had already, long before the hour appointed for the arrival of the ambassadors, imparted a harsh and bitter accent to the clamor of these people who were shut in, fitted into each other, pressed, trampled upon, stifled. Nothing was to be heard but imprecations on the Flemish, the provost of the merchants, the Cardinal de Bourbon, the bailiff of the courts, Madame Marguerite of Austria, the sergeants with their rods, the cold, the heat, the bad weather, the Bishop of Paris, the Pope of the Fools, the pillars, the statues, that closed door, that open window, all to the vast amusement of a band of scholars and lackeys scattered through the mass, who mingled with all this discontent their teasing remarks and their malicious suggestions, and pricked the general bad temper with a pin, so to speak. Among the rest, there was a group of these merry imps, who, after smashing the glass in a window, had seated themselves heartily on the entablature, and from that point dispatched their gaze and their railleries both within and without, upon the throng in the hall, and the throng upon the place. It was easy to see, from their parody gestures, their ringing laughter, the bantering appeals which they exchanged with their comrades, from one end of the hall to the other, that these young clerks did not share the weariness and fatigue of the rest of the spectators, and that they understood very well the art of extracting, for their own private diversion, from that which they had under their eyes, a spectacle which made them await the other with patience. "Upon my soul, so it's you, Joannes Frollo Domolendino," cried one of them to a sort of little light-haired imp with a well-favored and malign countenance, clinging to the acanthus leaves of a capital. "You are well named John of the Mill, for your 2 arms and your 2 legs have the air of 4 wings fluttering on the breeze. How long have you been here?" "By the mercy of the devil," retorted Joannes Frollo, "these 4 hours and more, and I hope they will be reckoned to my credit in purgatory. I heard the 8 singers of the King of Sicily intone the first verse of 7 o'clock Mass in the Sainte-Chapelle." "Fine singers," replied the other, "with voices even more pointed than their caps. Before founding a Mass for Monsieur Saint Jean, the king should have inquired whether Monsieur Saint Jean likes Latin droned out in a Provençal accent." "He did it for the sake of employing those accursed singers of the King of Sicily," cried an old woman sharply from among the crowd beneath the window. "I just put it to you, 1,000 livres parisis for a Mass, and out of the tax on sea fish in the markets of Paris to boot." "Peace, old crone," said a tall, grave person, stopping up his nose on the side towards the fishwife. "A Mass had to be founded. Would you wish the king to fall ill again?" "Bravely spoken, Sire Gilles Lecornu, Master Furrier of King's Robes," cried the little student, clinging to the capital. A shout of laughter from all the students greeted the unlucky name of the poor furrier of the king's robes. "Le cornu! Gilles le cornu!" said some. "Cornutus et hirsutus! Horned and hairy!" another went on. "He, of course!" continued the small imp on the capital. "What are they laughing at? An honorable man is Gilles le cornu, brother of Master Jehan le cornu, provost of the king's house, son of Master Mahier le cornu, first porter of the Bois de Vincennes, all bourgeois of Paris, all married from father to son." The gaiety redoubled. The big furrier, without uttering a word in reply, tried to escape all the eyes riveted upon him from all sides. But he perspired and panted in vain. Like a wedge entering the wood, his efforts served only to bury still more deeply in the shoulders of his neighbors, his large, apoplectic face purple with spite and rage. At length one of these, as fat, short, and venerable as himself, came to his rescue. "Abomination! Scholars addressing a bourgeois in that fashion in my day would have been flogged with a faggot, which would have afterwards been used to burn them." The whole band burst into laughter. "Hola, who is scolding so? Who is that screech owl of evil fortune?" "Hold, I know him," said one of them. "'Tis Master Andre Meunier." "Because he is one of the 4 sworn booksellers of the university," said the other. "Everything goes by 4s in that shop," cried a third. "The 4 nations, the 4 faculties, the 4 feasts, the 4 procurators, the 4 electors, the 4 booksellers." "Well," began Jean Frollo once more, "we must play the devil with them." "Meunier, we'll burn your books!" "Meunier, we'll beat your lackeys!" "Meunier, we'll kiss your wife!" "That fine Mademoiselle Oudard, who is as fresh and as gay though she were a widow." "Devil take you!" growled Master Andre Meunier. "Master Andre," pursued Jean Jehan, still clinging to his capital, "hold your tongue, or I'll drop on your head." Master Andre raised his eyes, seemed to measure in an instant the height of the pillar, the weight of the scamp, mentally multiplied that weight by the square of the velocity, and remained silent. Jehan, master of the field of battle, pursued triumphantly. "That's what I'll do, even if I am the brother of an archdeacon. Fine gentry are our people of the university, not to have caused our privileges to be respected on such a day as this. However, there is a maypole and a bonfire in the town, a mystery Pope of the Fools and Flemish ambassadors in the city, and at the university, nothing. Nevertheless, the Place Maubert is sufficiently large," interposed one of the clerks established on the window-sill. "Down with the rector, the electors, and the procurators!" cried Johans. "We must have a bonfire this evening in the Champ Gaillard," went on the other, "made of Master Andre's books." "And the desks of the scribes," added his neighbor, "and the beadles' wands, and the spittoons of the deans, and the cupboards of the procurators, and the hutches of the electors, and the stools of the rector." "Down with them," put in little Jehan as counterpoint. "Down with Master Andre, the beadles and the scribes, the theologians, the doctors, and the decretists, the procurators, the electors, and the rector." "The end of the world has come," muttered Master Andre, stopping up his ears. "By the way, there's the rector. See, he is passing through the place," cried one of those in the window. Each rivaled his neighbor in his haste to turn towards the place. "Is it really our venerable rector, Master Thibault?" demanded Jehan Frollo du Moulin, who, as he was clinging to one of the inner pillars, could not see what was going on outside. Yes, yes," replied all the others. "It is really he, Master Thibault, the rector." It was, in fact, the rector and all the dignitaries of the university who were marching in procession in front of the embassy, and at that moment traversing the place. The students crowded into the window, saluted them as they passed with sarcasms and ironical applause. The rector, who was walking at the head of his company, had to support the first broadside. It was severe. "Good day, monsieur le recteur. Hola, good day there. How does he manage to be here, the old gambler? Has he abandoned his dice? How he trots along on his mule. Her ears are not so long as his. Hola, good day, monsieur le recteur Thibault. Tybalt Eliator, old fool, old gambler. God preserve you. Did you throw double six often last night? Oh, what a decrepit face, livid and haggard and drawn with the love of gambling and of dice. Where are you bound for in that fashion, Thibault? Thibalde a dados, with your back turned to the university and trotting towards the town? He is on his way, no doubt, to seek a lodging in the Rue Thibault-Audet, cried Jehan du Monsieur Molin. The entire band repeated this quip in a voice of thunder, clapping their hands furiously. You are going to seek a lodging in the Rue Thibault-Audet, are you not, monsieur le recteur, gamester on the side of the devil? Then came the turns of the other dignitaries. Down with the beadles! Down with the mace-bearers! Tell me, Robin Puispan, who is that yonder? He is Gilbert de Souy, Gilbertus Dosoliaco, the Chancellor of the College of Autun. Hold on, here's my shoe. You are better placed than I. Fling it in his face. Saturnalitios mitimos ecce nuces. Down with the 6 theologians with their white surplices. Are those the theologians? I thought they were the white geese given by Saint Geneviève to the city for the fief of Rogny. Down with the doctors! Down with the cardinal disputations and quibblers! My cap to you, Chancellor of Saint Geneviève! You have done me a wrong. 'Tis true. He gave my place in the nation of Normandy to little Ascanio Falzapada, who comes from the province of Bourges, since he's an Italian. That is an injustice, said all the scholars. Down with the Chancellor of Saint Geneviève! Ohé, Master Joachim de la Dours! Ohé, Louis Daoui! Ohé, Lambert Hotama! May the devil stifle the procurator of the German nation! And the chaplains of the Sainte-Chapelle, with their grey amices, cum tunices grises. Seu du pelibus grisis foratis. Olae, Master of Arts! All the beautiful black copes, all the fine red copes. They make a fine tale for the rector. One would say that he was a Doge of Venice on his way to his bridal with the sea. Say, Jehan, here are the cannons of Saint Geneviève. To the deuce with a whole set of cannons. Abbe Claude Chouat, Dr. Claude Chouat, are you in search of Marie Lagafard? She is in the Rue de Glatigny. She is making the bed of the king of the debauchees. She is paying her 4 deniers, quatuor deniaros. Aut unum bombum. Would you like to have her pay you in the face? Comrades, Mr. Simon Seguin, the Elector of Picardy, with his wife on the crupper. Post equitem seclet atra jura. Behind the horseman sits black care. Courage, Master Simon. Good day, Mr. Elector. Good night, Madame Electress. How happy they are to see all that, sighed Joan de Melandino, still perched in the foliage of his capital. Meanwhile, the sworn bookseller of the university, Master André Mounier, was inclining his ear to the furrier of the king's robes, Master Gilles Lecornu. I tell you, sir, that the end of the world has come. No one has ever beheld such outbreaks among the students. It is the accursed inventions of this century that are ruining everything. Artilleries, bombards, and above all, printing, that other German pest. No more manuscripts, no more books. Printing will kill bookselling. It is the end of the world that is drawing nigh. I see that plainly, from the progress of velvet stuffs, said the fur merchant. At this moment, midday sounded. Ha! Exclaimed the entire crowd in one voice. The scholars held their peace. Then a great hurly-burly ensued, a vast movement of feet, hands, and heads, a general outbreak of coughs and handkerchiefs. Each one arranged himself, assuming his post, raised himself up, and grouped himself. Then came a great silence. All necks remained outstretched, all mouths remained open, all glances were directed towards the marble table. Nothing made its appearance there. The bailiff's 4 sergeants were still there, stiff, motionless, as painted statues. All eyes turned to the estrade reserved for the Flemish envoys. The door remained closed, the platform empty. This crowd had been waiting since daybreak for 3 things: noonday, the embassy from Flanders, the mystery play. Noonday alone had arrived on time. On this occasion, it was too much. They waited 1, 2, 3, 5 minutes, a quarter of an hour. Nothing came. The dais remained empty, the theatre dumb. In the meantime, wrath had succeeded to impatience. Irritated words circulated in a low tone, still it is true. The mystery, they murmured in hollow voices. Heads began to ferment. A tempest, which was only rumbling in the distance as yet, was floating on the surface of this crowd. It was Jehan du Moulin who struck the first spark from it. "The mystery! And to the devil with the Flemings!" he exclaimed at the full force of his lungs, twining like a serpent around his pillar. The crowd clapped their hands. "The mystery!" it repeated, "and may all the devils take Flanders!" "We must have the mystery instantly," resumed the student, "or else my advice is that we should hang the bailiff of the courts, by way of a morality and a comedy." "Well said," cried the people, "and let us begin the hanging with his sergeants." A grand acclamation followed. The 4 poor fellows began to turn pale and to exchange glances. The crowd hurled itself towards them, and they already beheld the frail wooden railing which separated them from it giving way and bending before the pressure of the throng. It was a critical moment. "To the sack! To the sack!" rose the cry on all sides. At that moment the tapestry of the dressing-room, which we have described above, was raised, and afforded passage to a personage, the mere sight of whom suddenly stopped the crowd, and changed its wrath into curiosity as by enchantment. "Silence! Silence!" The personage, but little reassured, and trembling in every limb, advanced to the edge of the marble table with a vast amount of bows, which, in proportion as he drew nearer, more and more resembled genuflections. In the meanwhile, tranquillity had gradually been restored. All that remained was that slight murmur which always rises above the silence of a crowd. "Messieurs the bourgeois," said he, "and mademoiselle the bourgeoises, we shall have the honor of declaiming and representing, before His Eminence Monsieur the Cardinal, a very beautiful morality which has for its title, 'The Good Judgment of Madame the Virgin Mary.' I am to play Jupiter. His Eminence is, at this moment, escorting the very honorable embassy of the Duke of Austria, which is detained at present listening to the harangue of Monsieur the Rector of the University at the Gate Baudet. As soon as His Illustrious Eminence the Cardinal arrives, we will begin." It is certain that nothing less than the intervention of Jupiter was required to save the 4 unfortunate sergeants of the bailiff of the courts. If we had the happiness of having invented this very veracious tale, and of being, in consequence, responsible for it before Our Lady Criticism, it is not against us that the classic precept nec Deus intercit could be invoked. Moreover, the costume of Signor Jupiter was very handsome, and contributed not a little towards calming the crowd, by attracting all its attention. Jupiter was clad in a coat of mail, covered with black velvet, with gilt nails. And had it not been for the rouge and the huge red beard, each of which covered one half of his face, had it not been for the roll of gilded cardboard, spangled and all bristling with strips of tinsel, which he held in his hand, and in which the eyes of the initiated easily recognized thunderbolts, had not his feet been flesh-colored and banded with ribbons in Greek fashion, he might have borne comparison, so far as the severity of his mane was concerned, with a Breton archer from the guard of Monsieur de Berry. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of The Hunchback of Notre Dame by Victor Hugo. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2 Pierre Gringoire. Nevertheless, as he harangued them, the satisfaction and admiration unanimously excited by his costume were dissipated by his words, and when he reached that untoward conclusion, "As soon as His Illustrious Eminence the Cardinal arrives, we will begin," his voice was drowned in a thunder of hooting. "Begin instantly! The mystery immediately!" shrieked the people. And above all the voices, that of Joan de Molendino was audible, piercing the uproar like the fife's derisive serenade. "Commence instantly!" yelped the scholar. "Down with Jupiter and the Cardinal de Bourbon!" vociferated Robin Puispin and the other clerks perched in the window. "The morality, this very instant!" repeated the crowd. "This very instant! The sack and the rope for the comedians and the Cardinal!" Poor Jupiter, haggard, frightened, pale beneath his rouge, dropped his thunderbolt, took his cap in his hand. Then he bowed and trembled and stammered, "His Eminence, the ambassadors, Madame Marguerite of Flanders—" He did not know what to say. In truth, he was afraid of being hung. Hung by the populace for waiting. Hung by the Cardinal for not having waited. He saw between the two dilemmas only an abyss, that is to say, a gallows. Luckily, someone came to rescue him from his embarrassment and assume the responsibility. An individual who was standing beyond the railing in the free space around the marble table, and whom no one had yet caught sight of, since his long, thin body was completely sheltered from every visual ray by the diameter of the pillar against which he was leaning, this individual, we say, tall, gaunt, pallid, blond, still young, although already wrinkled about the brow and cheeks, with brilliant eyes and a smiling mouth, clad in garments of black serge, worn and shining with age, approached the marble table, and made a sign to the poor sufferer. But the other was so confused that he did not see him. The newcomer advanced another step. "Jupiter," he said, "my dear Jupiter." The other did not hear. At last, the tall blonde, driven out of patience, shrieked almost in his face. "Michel Giborne!" "Who calls me?" said Jupiter, as though awakened with a start. "I," replied the person clad in black. "Ah," said Jupiter. "Begin at once," went on the other. "Satisfy the populace. I undertake to appease the bailiff, who will appease Monsieur the Cardinal." Jupiter breathed once more. "Messieurs the bourgeois," he cried at the top of his lungs to the crowd, which continued to hoot him. "We are going to begin at once." "Evoe Jupiter, plaudite cives! All hail Jupiter! Applaud, citizens!" shouted the scholars. "Noel! Noel! Good! Good!" shouted the people. The hand-clapping was deafening, and Jupiter had already withdrawn under his tapestry, while the hall still trembled with acclamations. In the meanwhile, the personage who had so magically turned the tempest into dead calm, as our old and dear Corneille puts it, had modestly retreated to the half-shadow of his pillar, and would, no doubt, have remained invisible there, motionless and mute as before, had he not been plucked by the sleeve by two young women, who, standing in the front row of the spectators, had noticed his colloquy with Michel Giborne, Jupiter. "Master," said one of them, making him a sign to approach. "Hold your tongue, my dear Leonard," said her neighbor, pretty, fresh, and very brave, in consequence of being dressed up in her best attire. "He is not a clerk. He is a layman. You must not say master to him, but monsieur." "Monsieur," said Leonard. The stranger approached the railing. "What would you have of me, damsels?" he asked with alacrity. "Oh, nothing," replied Leonard, in great confusion. "It is my neighbor, Gisquette la Gentienne, who wishes to speak with you." "Not so," replied Gisquette, blushing. "It was Leonard who called you master. I only told her to say monsieur." The two young girls dropped their eyes. The man, who asked nothing better than to enter into conversation, looked at them with a smile. "So, you have nothing to say to me, damsels?" "Oh, nothing at all," replied Gisquette. "Nothing," said Leonard. The tall, light-haired young man retreated a step, but the two curious maidens had no mind to let slip their prize. "Monsieur," said Gisquette, with the impetuosity of an open sluice, or of a woman who has made up her mind, "do you know that soldier who is to play the part of Madame the Virgin in the mystery?" "You mean the part of Jupiter?" replied the stranger. Yes," said Leonard. "Isn't she stupid? So, you know Jupiter?" "Michel Giborne," replied the unknown. "Yes, madame." "He has a fine beard," said Leonard. "Will what they are about to say here be fine?" inquired Gisquette timidly. "Very fine, mademoiselle," replied the unknown, without the slightest hesitation. "What is it to be?" said Leonard. "The good judgment of Madame the Virgin. A morality, if you please, damselle." "Ah, that makes the difference," responded Leonard. A brief silence ensued, broken by the stranger. "It is a perfectly new morality, and one which has never yet been played." "Then it is not the same one," said Gisquette, "that was given 2 years ago, on the day of the entrance of Monsieur the Legate, and where 3 handsome maids played the parts." "Of sirens," said Leonard. "And all naked," added the young man. Leonard lowered her eyes modestly. Gisquette glanced at her and did the same. He continued with a smile. "It was a very pleasant thing to see. Today it is a morality made expressly for Madame the Demoiselle of Flanders." "Will they sing shepherd songs?" inquired Gisquette. "Fie," said the stranger. "In a morality you must not confound styles. If it were a farce, well and good." "That is a pity," resumed Gisquette. "That day, at the Ponceau fountain, there were wild men and women who fought and assumed many aspects, as they sang little motets and bergerettes." "That which is suitable for a legate," returned the stranger, with a good deal of dryness, "is not suitable for a princess." "And beside them," resumed Leonard, "played many brass instruments, making great melodies." "And for the refreshment of the passers-by," continued Gisquette, "the fountain spouted through 3 mouths wine, milk, and hippocras, of which everyone drank who wished." "And a little below the Ponceau at the Trinity," pursued Leonard, "there was a passion performed, and without any speaking." "How well I remember that!" exclaimed Gisquette. "God on the cross, and the 2 thieves on the right and left." Here the young gossips, growing warm at the memory of the entrance of Monsieur the Legate, both began to talk at once. And further on, at the Painter's Gate, there were other personages very richly clad. And at the Fountain of St. Innocent, that huntsman who was chasing a hind with a great clamor of dogs and hunting horns. And at the Paris slaughterhouses, stages representing the fortress of Dieppe. And when the legate passed, you remember, Gisquette, they made the assault, and the English all had their throats cut. And against the gate of the Châtelet there were very fine personages, and on the porte au change, which was all draped above. And when the legate passed, they let fly on the bridge more than 200 sorts of birds. Wasn't it beautiful, Leonard? It will be better today, finally resumed their interlocutor, who seemed to listen to them with impatience. Do you promise us that this mystery will be fine? Said Gisquette. Without doubt, he replied. Then he added, with a certain emphasis, I am the author of it, damsels. Truly? Said the young girls, quite taken aback. Truly, replied the poet, bridling a little. That is to say, there are two of us. Jehan Marchand, who has sawed the planks and erected the framework of the theatre and the woodwork, and I, who have made the piece. My name is Pierre Gringoire. The author of the Cid could not have said Pierre Corneille with more pride. Our readers have been able to observe that a certain amount of time must have already elapsed from the moment when Jupiter had retired beneath the tapestry to the instant when the author of the New Morality had thus abruptly revealed himself to the innocent admiration of Gisquette and Leonard. Remarkable fact, that whole crowd, so tumultuous but a few moments before, now waited amiably on the word of the comedian, which proves the eternal truth, still experienced every day in our theaters, that the best means of making the public wait patiently is to assure them that one is about to begin instantly. However, Scholar Joanne had not fallen asleep. Hola, eh! He shouted suddenly, in the midst of the peaceable waiting which had followed the tumult. Jupiter, Madame the Virgin, buffoons of the devil, are you jeering at us? The peace! The peace! Commence, or we will commence again! That was all that was needed. The music of high and low instruments immediately became audible from the interior of the stage. The tapestry was raised. 4 personages, in motley attire and painted faces, emerged from it, climbed the steep ladder of the theatre, and arrived upon the upper platform, arranged themselves in a line before the public, whom they saluted with profound reverences. Then the symphony ceased. The mystery was about to begin. The 4 personages, after having reaped a rich reward of applause for their reverences, began, in the midst of profound silence, a prologue, which we gladly spare the reader. Moreover, as happens in our own day, the public was more occupied with the costumes that the actors wore than with the roles that they were enacting. And in truth, they were right. All 4 were dressed in party-colored robes of yellow and white, which were distinguished from each other only by the nature of the stuff. The first was of gold and silver brocade, the second of silk, the third of wool, the fourth of linen. The first of these personages carried in his right hand a sword, the second 2 golden keys, the third a pair of scales, the fourth a spade. And, in order to aid sluggish minds which would have not seen clearly through the transparency of these attributes, there was to be read in large black letters on the hem of the robe of brocade, "My name is Nobility." On the hem of the silken robe, "My name is Clergy." On the hem of the woolen robe, "My name is Merchandise." On the hem of the linen robe, "My name is Labor." The sex of the 2 male characters was briefly indicated to every judicious spectator by their shorter robes, and by the cap which they wore on their heads, while the 2 female characters, less briefly clad, were covered with hoods. Much ill will would also have been required, not to comprehend, through the medium of the poetry of the prologue, that labor was wedded to merchandise, and clergy to nobility, and that the 2 happy couples possessed in common a magnificent golden dolphin, which they desired to adjudge to the fairest only. So they were roaming about the world, seeking and searching for this beauty, and, after having successfully rejected the Queen of Golconda, the Princess of Trebizond, the daughter of the Grand Khan of Tartary, etc., labor and clergy, nobility and merchandise had come to rest upon the marble table of the Palais de Justice, and to utter, in the presence of the honest audience, as many sentences and maxims as could then be dispensed at the Faculty of Arts, at examinations, sophisms, determinances, figures, and acts, where the masters took their degrees. All this was, in fact, very fine. Nevertheless, in that throng, upon which the four allegories vied with each other in pouring out floods of metaphors, there was no ear more attentive, no heart that palpitated more, not an eye was more haggard, no neck more outstretched, than the eye, the ear, the neck, and the heart of the author, of the poet, of that brave Pierre Gringoire, who had not been able to resist a moment before the joy of telling his name to two pretty girls. He had retreated a few paces from them, behind his pillar, and there he listened, looked, enjoyed. The amiable applause which had greeted the beginning of his prologue was still echoing in his bosom, and he was completely absorbed in that species of ecstatic contemplation with which an author beholds his ideas fall, one by one, from the mouth of the actor into the vast silence of the audience. Worthy Pierre Gringoire. It pains us to say it, but this first ecstasy was speedily disturbed. Hardly had Gringoire raised this intoxicating cup of joy and triumph to his lips when a drop of bitterness was mingled with it. A tattered mendicant, who could not collect any coins, lost as he was in the midst of the crowd, and who had not probably found sufficient indemnity in the pockets of his neighbors, had hit upon the idea of perching himself upon some conspicuous point, in order to attract looks and alms. He had, accordingly, hoisted himself during the first verses of the prologue, with the aid of the pillars of the reserve gallery, to the cornice which ran round the balustrade at its lower edge, and there he had seated himself, soliciting the attention and the pity of the multitude, with his rags and a hideous sore which covered his right arm. However, he uttered not a word. The silence which he preserved allowed the prologue to proceed without hindrance, and no perceptible disorder would have ensued if ill luck had not willed that the scholar Joanne should catch sight from the heights of his pillar of the mendicant and his grimaces. A wild fit of laughter took possession of the young scamp, who, without caring that he was interrupting the spectacle and disturbing the universal composure, shouted boldly, "Look! See that sickly creature asking alms!" Anyone who has thrown a stone into a frog pond, or fired a shot into a covey of birds, can form an idea of the effect produced by these incongruous words in the midst of the general attention. It made Gringoire shudder as though it had been an electric shock. The prologue stopped short, and all heads turned tumultuously towards the beggar, who, far from being disconcerted by this, saw in this incident a good opportunity for reaping his harvest, who had begun to whine in a doleful way, half closing his eyes the while. "Charity, please!" "Well, upon my soul," resumed Joanne, "it's Clopin Trifot. All away, my friend. Did your sore bother you on the leg, that you have transferred it to your arm?" So saying, with the dexterity of a monkey, he flung a bit of silver into the grey felt hat which the beggar held in his ailing arm. The mendicant received both the alms and the sarcasm without wincing, and continued in lamentable tones, "Charity, please!" This episode considerably distracted the attention of the audience, and a goodly number of the spectators, among them Robin Poussin, and all the clerks at their head, gaily applauded this eccentric duet, which the scholar, with his shrill voice, and the mendicant had just improvised in the middle of the prologue. Gringoire was highly displeased. On recovering from his first stupefaction, he bestirred himself to shout to the four personages on the stage, "Go on! What the devil! Go on!" without even deigning to cast a glance of disdain upon the two interrupters. At that moment, he felt someone pluck at the hem of his surtout. He turned round, and not without ill humor, and found considerable difficulty in smiling. But he was obliged to do so nevertheless. It was the pretty arm of Gisquette la Gentienne, which, passing through the railing, was soliciting his attention in this manner. "Monsieur," said the young girl, "are they going to continue?" "Of course," replied Gringoire, a good deal shocked by the question. "In that case, monsieur," she resumed, "would you have the courtesy to explain to me—" "What they are about to say?" interrupted Gringoire. "Well, listen." "No," said Gisquette, "but what they have said so far." Gringoire started, like a man whose wound has been probed to the quick. "A plague on the stupid and dull-witted little girl," he muttered between his teeth. From that moment forth, Gisquette was nothing to him. In the meantime, the actors had obeyed his injunction, and the public, seeing that they were beginning to speak again, began once more to listen, not without having lost many beauties in the sort of soldered joint which was formed between the two portions of the piece thus abruptly cut short. Gringoire commented on it bitterly to himself. Nevertheless, tranquillity was gradually restored. The scholar held his peace, the mendicant counted over some coins in his hat, and the piece resumed the upper hand. It was, in fact, a very fine work, and one which, as it seems to us, might be put to use today, by the aid of a little rearrangement. The exposition, rather long and rather empty, that is to say, according to the rules, was simple, and Gringoire, in the candid sanctuary of his own conscience, admired its clearness. As the reader may surmise, the four allegorical personages were somewhat weary with having traversed the three sections of the world without having found suitable opportunity for getting rid of their golden dolphin. Thereupon, a eulogy of the marvelous fish, with 1,000 delicate allusions to the young betrothed of Margarita Flanders, then sadly cloistered in at Amboise, and without a suspicion that labor and clergy, nobility and merchandise had just made the circuit of the world in his behalf. The sad Dauphin was then young, was handsome, was stout, and above all, magnificent origin of all royal virtues, he was the son of the Lion of France. I declare that this bold metaphor is admirable, and that the natural history of the theatre, on a day of allegory and royal marriage songs, is not in the least startled by a dolphin who is the son of a lion. It is precisely these rare and Pindaric mixtures which prove the poet's enthusiasm. Nevertheless, in order to play the part of critic also, the poet might have developed this beautiful idea in something less than 200 lines. It is true that the mystery was to last from noon until 4 o'clock, in accordance with the orders of Monsieur the Provost, and that it was necessary to say something. Besides, the people listened patiently. All at once, in the very middle of a quarrel between Mademoiselle Merchandise and Madame Nobility, at the moment when Monsieur Labor was giving utterance to this wonderful line, "In forest ne'er was seen a more triumphant beast," the door of the reserved gallery, which had hitherto remained so importunely closed, opened still more inopportunely, and the ringing voice of the usher announced abruptly, "His Eminence, Monseigneur the Cardinal de Bourbon." End of Chapter 2. Book First, Chapter 3 of The Hunchback of Notre Dame, by Victor Hugo. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3. Monsieur the Cardinal. Poor Gringoire! the din of all the great double petards of the Saint Jean, the discharge of 20 arquebuses on supports, the detonation of that famous serpentine of the Tower of Billy, which, during the siege of Paris on Sunday the 26th of September 1465, killed 7 Burgundians at one blow. The explosion of all the powder stored at the gate of the temple would have rent his ears less rudely at that solemn and dramatic moment than these few words which fell from the lips of the usher. His Eminence, Monseigneur the Cardinal de Bourbon. It is not that Pierre Gringoire either feared or disdained Monsieur the Cardinal. He had neither the weakness nor the audacity for that. A true eclectic, as it would be expressed nowadays, Gringoire was one of those firm and lofty, moderate and calm spirits, which always know how to bear themselves amid all circumstances. Stare indimidio rerum, and who are full of reason and of liberal philosophy, while still setting store by cardinals. A rare, precious, and never-interrupted race of philosophers to whom wisdom, like another Ariadne, seems to have given a clue of thread which they have been walking along unwinding since the beginning of the world, through the labyrinth of human affairs. One finds them in all ages, ever the same, that is to say, always according to all times. And without reckoning our Pierre Gringoire, who may represent them in the 15th century if we succeed in bestowing upon him the distinction which he deserves, it certainly was their spirit which animated Father de Breuil when he wrote in the 16th these naively sublime words worthy of all the centuries. I am a Parisian by nation and a Parisian in language, for parisia in Greek signifies liberty of speech, of which I have made use even towards monseigneurs the cardinals, uncle and brother to Monsieur the Prince de Conti, always with respect to their greatness and without offending any one of their suite, which is much to say. There was then neither hatred for the cardinal nor disdain for his presence in the disagreeable impression produced upon Pierre Gringoire. Quite the contrary. Our poet had too much good sense and too threadbare a coat not to attach particular importance to having the numerous allusions in his prologue, and in particular the glorification of the Dauphin, son of the Lion of France, fall upon the most eminent ear. But it is not interest which predominates in the noble nature of poets. I suppose that the entity of the poet may be represented by the number 10. It is certain that a chemist, on analyzing and pharmacopolizing it, as Rabelais says, would find it composed of 1 part interest to 9 parts of self-esteem. Now, at the moment when the door had opened to admit the cardinal, the 9 parts of self-esteem in Gringoire, swollen and expanded by the breath of popular admiration, were in a state of prodigious augmentation, beneath which disappeared, as though stifled, that imperceptible molecule of which we have just remarked upon in the constitution of poets. A precious ingredient, by the way, a ballast of reality and humanity, without which they would not touch earth. Gringoire enjoyed seeing, feeling, fingering, so to speak, an entire assembly. Of knaves, it is true, but what matters that? Stupefied, petrified, and as though asphyxiated in the presence of the incommensurable tirades which welled up every instant from all parts of his bridal song. I affirm that he shared the general beatitude, and that quite the reverse of La Fontaine, who at the presentation of his comedy of the Florentine asked, "Who is the ill-bred lout who made that rhapsody?" Gringoire would gladly have inquired of his neighbor, "Whose masterpiece is this?" The reader can now judge of the effect produced upon him by the abrupt and unseasonable arrival of the cardinal.
Oh, hello,
that
Noel.
which he had feared was only too fully realized. The entrance of His Eminence upset the audience. All heads turned towards the gallery. It was no longer possible to hear oneself.
Oh, no. Where
"The
else would I
Cardinal!
be?
The Cardinal!" repeated all mouths. The unhappy prologue stopped short for the second time. The Cardinal halted for a moment on the threshold of the estrade. While he was sending a rather indifferent glance around the audience, the tumult redoubled. Each person wished to get a better view of it. Each man vied with the other in thrusting his head over his neighbor's shoulder. He was, in fact, an exalted personage, the sight of whom was well worth any other comedy. Charles, Cardinal de Bourbon, Archbishop and Comte of Leon, Primate of the Gauls, was allied both to Louis XI through his brother Pierre, Seigneur de Beaujeu, who had married the king's eldest daughter, and to Charles the Bold through his mother, Agnes of Burgundy. Now, the dominating trait, the peculiar and distinctive trait of the character of the Primate of the Gauls, was the spirit of the courtier and devotion to the powers that be. The reader can form an idea of the numberless embarrassments which this double relationship had caused him, and of all the temporal reefs among which his spiritual bark had been forced to tack, in order not to suffer shipwreck on either Louis or Charles. That Scylla and that Charybdis which had devoured the Duc de Nemours and the Constable de Saint-Pol. Thanks to heaven's mercy, he had made the voyage successfully and had reached home without hindrance. But although he was in port, and precisely because he was in port, he never recalled without disquiet the varied haps of his political career, so long uneasy and laborious. Thus, he was in the habit of saying that the year 1476 had been white and black for him, meaning thereby that in the course of that year he had lost his mother, the Duchesse de la Bourbonnais, and his cousin, the Duke of Burgundy, and that one grief had consoled him for the other. Nevertheless, he was a fine man. He had led a joyous cardinal's life, liked to enliven himself with the royal vintage of Chaluot, did not hate Richard de la Garmois and Thomas la Saillarde, bestowed alms on pretty girls rather than on old women, and for all these reasons was very agreeable to the populace of Paris. He never went about otherwise than surrounded by a small court of bishops and abbés of high lineage, gallant, jovial, and given to carousing on occasion. And, more than once, the good and devout women of Saint-Germain-d'Auxerre, when passing at night beneath the brightly illuminated windows of Bourbon, had been scandalized to hear the same voices, which had intoned vespers for them during the day, caroling, to the clinking of glasses, the Bacchic proverb of Benedict XII, that pope who had added a third crown to the tiara, Bibamus Papaliter. It was this justly acquired popularity, no doubt, which preserved him on his entrance from any bad reception at the hands of the mob, which had been so displeased but a moment before, and very little disposed to respect a cardinal on the very day when it was to elect a pope. But the Parisians cherished little rancor, and then, having forced the beginning of the play by their authority, the good bourgeois had got the upper hand of the cardinal, and this triumph was sufficient for them. Moreover, the Cardinal de Bourbon was a handsome man. He wore a fine scarlet robe, which he carried off very well. That is to say, he had all the women on his side, and consequently the best half of the audience. Assuredly, it would be injustice and bad taste to hoot a cardinal for having come late to the spectacle, when he is a handsome man and when he wears his scarlet robe well. He entered then, bowed to those present with the hereditary smile of the great for the people, and directed his course slowly towards his scarlet velvet armchair, with the air of thinking of something quite different. His cortege, what we should nowadays call his staff, of bishops and abbés invaded the estrade in his train, not without causing redoubled tumult and curiosity among the audience. Each man vied with his neighbor in pointing them out and naming them, in seeing who should recognize at least one of them. This one, the Bishop of Marseille, aloud, if my memory serves me right. This one, the Primicier of Saint-Denis. This one, Robert de Laspinasse, Abbé of Saint-Germain-des-Prés. that libertine brother of a mistress of Louis XI, all with many errors and absurdities. As for the scholars, they swore. This was their day, their feast of fools, their Saturnalia, the annual orgy of the corporation of law clerks and of the school. There was no turpitude which was not sacred on that day. And then there were gay gossips in the crowd. Simone Quattrelivre, Agnes Legardine, and Rabine Pierre de Beau. Was it not the least that one could do to swear at one's ease and revile the name of God a little on so fine a day, in such good company as dignitaries of the church and loose women? So they did not abstain, and in the midst of the uproar there was a frightful concert of blasphemies and enormities of all the unbridled tongues, the tongues of clerks and students, restrained during the rest of the year by the fear of the hot iron of Saint Louis. Poor Saint Louis, how they set him at defiance in his own court of law! Each one of them selected from the newcomers on the platform a black, gray, white, or violet cassock as his target. Joannes Frollo de Molondine, in his quality of brother to an archdeacon, boldly attacked the scarlet. He sang in deafening tones, with his impudent eyes fastened on the cardinal, "Capa repleto miro!" All these details, which we here lay bare for the edification of the reader, were so covered by the general uproar that they were lost in it before reaching the reserved platforms. Moreover, they would have moved the cardinal but little, so much a part of the customs were the liberties of that day. Moreover, he had another cause for solicitude, and his mien as wholly preoccupied with it, which entered the estrade the same time as himself. This was the embassy from Flanders. Not that he was a profound politician, nor was he borrowing trouble about the possible consequences of the marriage of his cousin Marguerite de Bourgogne to his cousin Charles, Dauphin de Vienne, nor as to how long the good understanding which had been patched up between the Duke of Austria and the King of France would last, nor how the King of England would take this disdain of his daughter. All that troubled him but little, and he gave a warm reception every evening to the wine of the royal vintage of Chaillot, without a suspicion that several flasks of that same wine, somewhat revised and corrected, it is true, by Dr. Quartier, cordially offered to Edward IV by Louis XI, would, some fine morning, rid Louis XI of Edward IV. The much-honored embassy of Monsieur the Duke of Austria brought the cardinal none of these cares, but it troubled him in another direction. It was, in fact, somewhat hard, and we have already hinted at it on the second page of this book. For him, Charles de Bourbon, to be obliged to feast and receive cordially no one knows what bourgeois. For him, a cardinal, to receive aldermen. For him, a Frenchman, a jolly companion, to receive Flemish beer drinkers, and that in public. This was certainly one of the most irksome grimaces that he had ever executed for the good pleasure of the king. So he turned toward the door, and with the best grace in the world, so well had he trained himself to it, when the usher announced in a sonorous voice, "Messieurs, the envoys of Monsieur the Duke of Austria." It is useless to add that the whole hall did the same. Then arrived, 2 by 2, with a gravity which made a contrast in the midst of the frisky ecclesiastical escort of Charles de Bourbon, the 48 ambassadors of Maximilian of Austria, having at their head the Reverend Father-in-God, Jehan, Abbot of Saint-Barthélemy, Chancellor of the Golden Fleece, and Jacques de Goy, Sieur d'Auby, Grand Bailiff of Gant. A deep silence settled over the assembly, accompanied by stifled laughter at the preposterous names and all the bourgeois designations which each of these personages transmitted with imperturbable gravity to the usher, who then tossed names and titles pell-mell and mutilated to the crowd below. There were Master Louis Relouf, alderman of the city of Louvain, Monsieur Clé d'Atoué, alderman of Brussels, Monsieur Paul de Brust, Sieur de Vormazel, President of Flanders, Master Jehan Collegans, Burgomaster of the city of Antwerp, Master Georges de la Moire, First Alderman of the Quaire of the city of Gant, Master Geldof van der Haeg, First Alderman of the Parchis of the said town, and the Sieur de Beerbeck, and Jehan Pinac, and Jehan de Marzel, etc., etc., etc. Bailiffs, aldermen, burgomasters, aldermen, bailiffs, all stiff, affectedly grave, formal, dressed out in velvet and damask, hooded with caps of black velvet, with great tufts of cypress gold.